Berlin, 1943. In the basement of a printing shop on Kreuzberg Street, 27 members of the Red Orchestra resistance cell wait in absolute silence. They've been waiting for 3 hours. Outside, the night is cold and moonless. Inside, the air smells of ink and fear. Every person in that room knows that the Gestapo has been closing in on their network for weeks. Every person knows that a raid could happen at any moment. And then, at exactly 11:45 p.m., a coded message arrives through their emergency channel. 4 words that shouldn't exist, 4 words that defy everything they understand about the war they're fighting. The message reads, "Wolves hunt at dawn. Leave now." The source? An officer of the Gestapo itself, not a double agent planted by the Allies, not a reluctant conscript looking for redemption, but a true believing member of the Nazi secret police, a man who had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler, a man who wore the death's head insignia on his collar. And this wasn't the first time. This was the 32nd warning he had sent to resistance cells across Berlin. 32 times he had betrayed his own organization. 32 times he had looked at the raid schedules, memorized the target addresses, and found a way to leak the information hours before his fellow officers kicked down the doors. The question that haunted the resistance then, and haunts historians now, is brutally simple. Why? The world thinks it knows the story of Nazi Germany. We know about the camps, the blitzkrieg, the final solution. We know about the Allies who fought from the outside and the resistance fighters who sabotaged from within. But there's a third category, a category so rare and so dangerous that most of its members didn't survive long enough to be remembered. These were the Germans inside the machine itself, the ones who wore the uniform, who had the power, who could have lived comfortable lives serving the Reich, but who chose instead to become ghosts in their own system. This is the story of one such ghost. His name was Wilhelm Kraus, and by all accounts he should never have turned. He wasn't Jewish. He wasn't a communist. He had no family members persecuted by the regime. In fact, on paper, Wilhelm Kraus was exactly what the Third Reich wanted: a university-educated lawyer from a respected Prussian family, physically fit, politically reliable, and coldly efficient at his job. He had joined the Gestapo in 1938, not out of fanaticism, but out of ambition. The secret police offered power, status, and immunity from the chaos-consuming Germany. By 1941, he had been promoted to the position of senior investigative officer in the counter-resistance division. His job was to hunt people like the ones he would later save. So what changed? The answer begins not with a grand moral awakening, but with something far more mundane and far more terrifying. It begins with a file. In the spring of 1942, Wilhelm Kraus was assigned to investigate a suspected resistance cell operating out of a church in the Prenzlauer Berg district. The lead was thin, based mostly on an anonymous denunciation, the kind of accusation that flooded Gestapo headquarters every single day. Neighbors denouncing neighbors, wives denouncing husbands, children denouncing parents. The machinery of terror ran on suspicion, and Wilhelm had processed hundreds of these cases. Most led nowhere. But this one was different. When Wilhelm and his team raided the church basement at dawn, they didn't find resistance fighters. They found 73 Jewish children, hidden by a network of Protestant ministers and their parishioners. The children ranged in age from 6 months to 14 years. They had been living in that basement for 8 months, surviving on donated food, learning to stay silent during the day, sleeping in shifts on thin mattresses laid directly on the concrete floor. And in the moment that Wilhelm Kraus walked down those basement stairs, flashlight in hand, and saw 73 pairs of eyes staring back at him, something inside him broke. The protocol was clear. He was supposed to arrest everyone present, document the children, and transfer them to the collection point for deportation east. His colleagues were already upstairs, rounding up the ministers. The paperwork would be simple, the commendations would follow. But Wilhelm stood there in that basement, looking at a little girl no older than 6 who was clutching a stuffed rabbit, and he made a choice that would define the rest of his short life. He walked back upstairs, told his commanding officer that the basement was empty, except for old church supplies, and filed a report stating that the denunciation had been malicious and unfounded. Then he went home, sat at his kitchen table until sunrise, and began planning how to do it again. Not just once, not as a moment of weakness, but systematically, repeatedly, as a second career running parallel to his first. The mechanics of his operation were breathtakingly simple, which is precisely why they worked for as long as they did. Wilhelm had access to raid schedules, surveillance reports, and target lists days, sometimes weeks, before operations were executed. The Gestapo was efficient, but it was also bureaucratic. Plans were typed, copied, distributed to multiple departments. Wilhelm's position gave him legitimate reasons to review these documents. He would memorize the critical details, addresses, dates, times, and then he would find a way to pass the information along. Sometimes he used coded messages left in specific library books. Sometimes he used a network of couriers who didn't know they were working for a Gestapo officer. Sometimes he simply walked past a target address the night before a raid and left a chalk mark on the doorframe, a mark that resistance members had been taught to recognize as a warning to evacuate immediately. The brilliance of his system was its deniability. If anyone noticed the pattern, if anyone started asking why so many raids were coming up empty, Wilhelm had the perfect cover. He was a Gestapo officer investigating leaks. He could investigate himself. But every warning carried an impossible weight. Every time Wilhelm sent information to the resistance, he knew he was gambling not just with his own life, but with the lives of everyone he was trying to protect. If the resistance acted too obviously on his warnings, if they evacuated too efficiently or too consistently, patterns would emerge. The Gestapo would start looking for a mole. And when the Gestapo looked for moles, they always found someone. It didn't matter if that someone was guilty or innocent. They would be tortured until they confessed, and then they would be executed. Wilhelm knew this because he had participated in these interrogations himself. He had watched colleagues break suspects with methodical precision. He had signed the execution orders, and now, every night, he went home knowing that he could be next. That the knock on his door could come at any moment. That his name could appear on one of those lists he had spent years compiling. The man who warned the resistance lived every single day knowing that he was already a dead man walking. The only question was when his death would catch up with him. To understand why Wilhelm Kraus became the ghost inside the Gestapo, you have to understand what Berlin was in 1942. This wasn't the Berlin of grand parades and torchlit rallies that the propaganda films showed to the world. By the time Wilhelm walked down those church basement stairs, the war had already turned. The Eastern Front was devouring German soldiers at a rate of thousands per week. The Royal Air Force had begun its bombing campaign, and every few nights the city shook with explosions. Rationing had gone from inconvenient to desperate. The theaters still played, the cafes still served weak coffee, but beneath the surface of normal life everyone could feel it. The Reich was bleeding, and the tighter Hitler's grip became, the more brutal the internal repression grew. The Gestapo wasn't just hunting foreign spies anymore, they were hunting doubt itself. Any whisper of defeatism, any question about the Führer's strategy, any failure to display sufficient enthusiasm could result in arrest, interrogation, and disappearance. Wilhelm lived in this world professionally. He helped create it. Before that morning in the church, Wilhelm had been what the Gestapo called a model officer. His personnel file, which survived the war and now sits in a Berlin archive, describes him as meticulous, intelligent, and ideologically sound. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, a year before joining the Gestapo, not out of passionate belief but because party membership was becoming essential for professional advancement. His father had been a judge in the Weimar Republic, a man who believed in order, law, and the stability of the state. Wilhelm had inherited that belief. When the Nazis came to power, promising to restore German strength and eliminate the chaos of the Weimar years, Wilhelm saw them as a political solution to a political problem. He didn't worship Hitler. He simply thought the Nazis were Germany's best option for survival. And for years that pragmatic calculation worked. He rose through the ranks. He earned respect. He bought an apartment in a good neighborhood. He was engaged to be married to the daughter of a Wehrmacht general. On paper, Wilhelm Kraus was living the dream of the new Germany. But the church basement shattered that dream in a way that no amount of anti-Nazi propaganda ever could have. This wasn't an abstract moral question debated in university seminars. This was 73 children who would be dead within weeks if he followed his orders. And what haunted Wilhelm, what he would later confess to one of his resistance contacts, was how easy it had been for his colleagues to process the arrests upstairs. The ministers were beaten, handcuffed, and dragged to the trucks with the same casual efficiency that Wilhelm had seen applied to black market smugglers and petty criminals. There was no hesitation, no visible discomfort. These were men Wilhelm ate lunch with, men he played cards with on slow nights at headquarters, and they were preparing to send children to their deaths with the same emotional investment they brought to filing expense reports. That realization was worse than anything Wilhelm had imagined. The regime wasn't being run by monsters who knew they were evil. It was being run by ordinary men who had convinced themselves that evil was simply part of the job. Wilhelm could have walked away from the Gestapo after that day. He could have requested a transfer to a different department, claimed health problems, or even fled the country. Hundreds of Germans were doing exactly that, finding ways to extract themselves from the machinery of genocide without directly opposing it. But Wilhelm made a different calculation. He realized that his position inside the Gestapo gave him something rare and valuable: access to information that could save lives. He knew which neighborhoods were being targeted. He knew which networks were under surveillance. He knew the names on the arrest lists before the arrests happened, and most importantly, he knew that if he left, someone else would take his position, someone who would follow every order without question. Walking away would save his conscience, but it wouldn't save anyone else. So Wilhelm decided to stay. He would continue being a Gestapo officer by day, and by night he would become something else entirely. The first warning he sent out was clumsy and terrified him for weeks afterward. 3 days after the church incident, he learned that the Gestapo was planning a major operation against a communist cell in Wedding. He had the address, the date, and the exact time of the raid. Wilhelm spent an entire day debating whether to act. He knew the risks. If the warning was traced back to him, he would be executed. But he also knew that if he did nothing, at least 20 people would be arrested, tortured, and killed. That night, he walked to a public library in a different district, found a specific book that he knew was used as a dead drop by resistance couriers, and tucked a small piece of paper inside with the raid details written in plain German. Then he went home, vomited from the stress, and waited to see if he would be arrested. 2 days later, the Gestapo raided the Wedding address. The apartment was empty. The suspects had vanished. Wilhelm's commanding officer was furious, convinced that someone in the department had talked. But no investigation was launched. The Gestapo received dozens of failed raids every month, targets who disappeared, informants whose information turned out to be worthless. One more empty apartment didn't raise alarms. Wilhelm had gotten away with it, and that's when he realized he could do it again. Over the next 8 months, Wilhelm Kraus developed a system. It wasn't elaborate or high-tech. It was built on routines, careful observation, and the exploitation of one fundamental flaw in the Gestapo's structure. The organization was so consumed with hunting external enemies that it rarely looked inward. Wilhelm's daily schedule gave him perfect cover. As a senior investigative officer, he was expected to review case files, cross-reference intelligence reports, and coordinate with other departments. He had legitimate reasons to access restricted documents, to ask questions about upcoming operations, and to move through headquarters without suspicion. The Gestapo trusted its own. That trust was Wilhelm's greatest weapon. He would arrive at headquarters at 7 in the morning, spend an hour reviewing the day's operational briefings, and identify any scheduled raids or arrests that targeted resistance networks or hidden Jews. Then he would memorize the critical information, never writing anything down in his own handwriting, never making copies. By mid-morning, he would already know who was going to die that night unless he intervened. The communication methods varied, depending on the urgency and the target. For established resistance cells that had existing communication networks, Wilhelm used the library dead drop system. He would leave coded messages inside specific books, using a simple substitution cipher that resistance members had been trained to recognize. The codes were never complex, just enough to obscure the meaning if someone accidentally stumbled across the note. A message like "Uncle Franz visits Thursday evening at Alexanderplatz 12" would translate to a raid planned for Thursday night at an address near Alexanderplatz at midnight. For targets who weren't connected to known resistance networks, usually Jewish families hiding in cellars or attics, Wilhelm had to be more creative. Sometimes he would personally walk past the address the night before a raid and leave a chalk mark, a simple X on the doorframe that had become an underground symbol meaning "evacuate immediately." Other times he would anonymously tip off the building superintendent, claiming to be a concerned neighbor who had seen Gestapo surveillance teams in the area. The warnings were always vague enough to avoid direct suspicion, but specific enough to trigger action. But the system required constant adaptation because the Gestapo was learning too. By late 1942, officers at headquarters had begun noticing a troubling pattern. Too many raids were coming up empty. Too many targets were vanishing hours before arrests. The initial assumption was that informants were unreliable, or that resistance networks had improved their counter-surveillance. But some officers, particularly in the counterintelligence division, started asking more dangerous questions. Was there a leak inside the organization? Was someone feeding information to the enemy? The paranoia that the Gestapo inflicted on German society began turning inward. Internal investigations were launched. Officers were questioned about their loyalty. Polygraph tests, still experimental but increasingly used, were administered to personnel with access to sensitive operations. Wilhelm watched this all unfold from the inside, knowing that every day brought him closer to discovery. He started varying his methods more aggressively, sometimes sending warnings, sometimes deliberately not warning certain cells to avoid creating a perfect pattern. It was a grotesque calculus. Let some people die so that he could continue saving others. The psychological toll was immense. Wilhelm couldn't talk to anyone about what he was doing. He had no confidant, no support network, no way to process the weight of his double life. His fiancée noticed that he had become distant and irritable, that he drank more than he used to, that he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. She attributed it to the stress of his job, never knowing that her future husband was committing treason every single week. Wilhelm's health began to deteriorate. He lost weight. He developed insomnia. His hands would shake when he reviewed raid schedules, knowing that his decisions in the next few hours would determine who lived and who died. The resistance members he was saving had no idea who he was. They knew someone inside the Gestapo was helping them, but they didn't know his name, his face, or his motivations. To them, he was just a ghost, a mysterious source of warnings that seemed too good to be true. And Wilhelm preferred it that way. Anonymity was survival. By the spring of 1943, Wilhelm had sent 32 warnings, 32 raids disrupted, 32 cells evacuated. Historians estimate that his actions directly saved between 200 and 300 lives, though the exact number will never be known. Some of the people who escaped because of Wilhelm's warnings went on to survive the war. Others were caught in later raids, arrested by different Gestapo divisions or killed in the Allied bombing campaigns. But for a brief window of time, they lived because one man inside the machine decided that his conscience mattered more than his safety. The question that haunted the resistance then, and that haunts us now, is how long could he possibly keep this up? The Gestapo was closing in, not just on resistance networks, but on the possibility of a traitor within their own ranks. And Wilhelm Kraus, the ghost in the machine, was running out of time. The breaking point came in April of 1943, and it didn't come from the Gestapo's internal investigation. It came from something far more dangerous: success. Wilhelm's warnings had been so effective, so consistently accurate, that the resistance networks in Berlin began to trust them completely. And that trust made them careless. When you know a raid is coming, when you've been warned 32 times and evacuated successfully 32 times, you start to believe you're untouchable. You start taking risks you wouldn't normally take. You start staying in safe houses a few hours longer than you should. You start believing that your guardian angel inside the Gestapo will always come through. This overconfidence was exactly what the counterintelligence division had been waiting for. They didn't need to find the mole directly. They just needed to exploit the pattern the mole had created. And in mid-April, they set a trap. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Counterintelligence created a fake raid schedule, a complete fabrication with target addresses, dates, and operational details that looked identical to real Gestapo planning documents. But this fake schedule was only distributed to a select group of officers, fewer than 20 people, all of whom had access to the kind of information that had been leaking. The addresses listed in the fake schedule were real buildings, but they weren't actually harboring resistance members. They were empty apartments that the Gestapo had quietly rented under false names. The plan was simple: distribute the fake schedule, wait to see if warnings went out, and then watch to see who showed up at the empty apartments looking for people to evacuate. If resistance members appeared at those addresses, it would confirm that someone inside the Gestapo was leaking information. And more importantly, it would narrow down the list of suspects to fewer than 20 officers. Wilhelm Kraus was one of those 20 officers. He didn't know it was a trap. When the fake operational briefing crossed his desk on April 16th, it looked like every other briefing he had reviewed over the past 8 months. 3 raids scheduled for April 20th, targeting suspected resistance cells in Neukölln-Kreuzberg and Charlottenburg. The intelligence looked solid, the surveillance reports seemed legitimate, and the timing was urgent. Only 4 days until the operations were executed. Wilhelm followed his standard protocol. He memorized the addresses and dates, waited until lunch, and then walked to a public library 6 blocks from headquarters. He found the designated book, a worn copy of Goethe's Faust that served as his primary dead drop, and tucked a coded message inside. The message listed all 3 addresses and the raid date. Then he returned to headquarters, finished his paperwork, and went home, completely unaware that he had just walked into a noose. On the night of April 19th, resistance members appeared at all 3 target addresses. They came carefully, using their standard evacuation protocols, expecting to find comrades who needed to disappear before dawn. Instead, they found empty apartments, no one to warn, no one to evacuate. Just silence. The more experienced resistance members immediately understood what had happened. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't bad intelligence. This was a trap, and they had walked directly into it. They evacuated immediately, scattering into the night, but the damage was done. Gestapo surveillance teams had been watching all 3 buildings from concealed positions. They didn't arrest the resistance members who showed up. That wasn't the point. The point was to confirm the leak and to photograph everyone who appeared. Within 24 hours, the counterintelligence division had evidence that information was definitely being passed from inside headquarters to resistance networks. And more critically, they had narrowed the suspect pool to exactly 20 officers. The investigation that followed was brutal and methodical. All 20 officers on the distribution list were placed under covert surveillance. Their movements were tracked. Their phone calls were monitored. Their personal lives were investigated. The Gestapo used the same techniques against its own personnel that it used against suspected enemies of the state. Wilhelm noticed the increased scrutiny immediately. He saw unfamiliar faces in the hallways, officers he didn't recognize who seemed to be watching him. He noticed that his case files were being audited more frequently, that his decisions were being questioned by supervisors who had never bothered him before. And he understood, with a cold certainty that settled into his bones, that his time was running out. The ghost in the machine had been detected. They didn't know his name yet, but they knew he existed. And the Gestapo never stopped hunting until they found their target. Wilhelm had a choice to make, and he had to make it fast. He could run, flee Berlin, and try to disappear into the chaos of wartime Germany. Or he could stay, knowing that staying meant almost certain death, but also knowing that running would mean abandoning everyone who still depended on his warnings. It was an impossible choice, and Wilhelm Kraus had less than a week to make it. Wilhelm chose to stay. Not out of heroism, but out of a darker calculation. He knew that if he fled, the Gestapo would interpret his disappearance as a confession of guilt. They would intensify their investigation, interrogate everyone he had ever worked with, and tear apart his personal life looking for accomplices. His fiancée would be questioned. His family would be brought in for interrogation. His father, the retired judge, would be forced to answer for his son's treason. And worst of all, the resistance networks he had been protecting would be left completely blind. If Wilhelm disappeared, they would lose their only warning system at the exact moment when the Gestapo was most focused on destroying them. So Wilhelm made the calculation that he would stay in Berlin, continue his work and try to send out as many warnings as possible before they came for him. He would squeeze every last drop of value from his position, even if it meant accelerating his own execution. It was the math of a man who had already accepted that he was dead, but staying required a new level of operational security. Wilhelm couldn't use the library dead drop anymore. The Gestapo was almost certainly watching those locations now, photographing everyone who touched the books he had been using. He couldn't use chalk marks on doorframes. He couldn't use anonymous tips to building superintendents. Every method he had relied on for 8 months was now compromised, so Wilhelm improvised a more dangerous approach: direct contact. Through a series of carefully arranged meetings, using intermediaries who didn't know they were working for him, Wilhelm established a single point of contact with the Berlin resistance leadership. It was a woman named Käthe Niederkirchner, a communist organizer who had been operating underground since 1933. Käthe was suspicious at first. The idea of a Gestapo officer offering to help seemed like an obvious trap. But Wilhelm provided proof, specific details about past raids that only someone inside headquarters could have known, and he made Käthe a proposal. He would continue passing intelligence directly to her, but only her, cutting out all intermediaries to minimize the chance of exposure. It was a desperate gamble that violated every principle of resistance security, but it was also the only option left. The meetings happened in public places, always crowded, always changing. A busy train station at rush hour, a packed church service, a standing room only showing at a cinema. Wilhelm and Käthe would pass each other without acknowledgement, and in that brief moment of proximity, Wilhelm would transfer information. Sometimes it was a folded piece of paper slipped into her coat pocket. Sometimes it was a whispered sentence that Käthe would have to memorize instantly. The exchanges lasted seconds, but each one carried lethal risk. If surveillance teams spotted the contact, both of them would be arrested immediately. And the Gestapo's surveillance had become suffocatingly thorough. Wilhelm was being followed almost constantly now. Not obviously, not with uniformed officers trailing him down the street, but with the professional discretion of experienced counterintelligence operatives. They rotated teams to avoid detection. They used vehicles, static observation posts, and carefully timed foot surveillance. Wilhelm had been trained in these same techniques. He knew what to look for, and what terrified him was how good they were. To evade the surveillance, Wilhelm used a technique called dry cleaning, a series of unpredictable movements designed to expose or shake off anyone following him. He would enter a department store through one entrance and exit through another. He would board a tram, ride it for 2 stops, get off, and immediately board another one, going in the opposite direction. He would duck into public restrooms and wait, listening for footsteps that stopped outside the door. Sometimes these maneuvers worked. Sometimes Wilhelm would successfully break surveillance long enough to make contact with Käthe and pass along critical information. But other times he couldn't shake them, and he would have to abort the meeting entirely, knowing that somewhere in Berlin people were going to die that night because he couldn't deliver the warning in time. The guilt of those failures was worse than the fear of his own arrest. Wilhelm had crossed a threshold where his own survival mattered less than the mission. He was no longer trying to live. He was just trying to save as many people as possible before the end came. By late April, the internal investigation had narrowed its focus even further. From 20 suspects, counterintelligence had reduced the pool to 7 officers. Wilhelm Kraus was one of them. His colleagues in that group were being interrogated individually, asked to account for their movements, their contacts, their access to classified information. The interrogations weren't physically brutal yet, but they were psychologically intense, designed to create pressure and fear, to make guilty parties crack under the weight of scrutiny. Wilhelm was interviewed twice. Both times he maintained perfect composure, answering every question with the calm professionalism of a loyal Gestapo officer. He denied nothing because there was nothing concrete to deny. No one had seen him pass information. No one had caught him in a dead drop. The evidence against him was entirely circumstantial, just a pattern of access that matched the pattern of leaks. But Wilhelm knew that in the Gestapo, circumstantial evidence was often enough. They didn't need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They just needed suspicion. And Wilhelm could feel that suspicion tightening around him like a wire. The ghost in the machine was about to be unmasked. The only question was whether he could send out one more warning before they dragged him into the interrogation cells he knew so well. The final warning came on May 3rd, 1943, and it was the most important one Wilhelm Kraus would ever send. That morning, a classified operational order crossed his desk that made his blood turn cold. It wasn't a routine raid on a small resistance cell. It was something far bigger. The Gestapo had finally located the central coordination hub of the Berlin Underground, a network that connected dozens of smaller cells across the city. The hub was operating out of a factory basement in Lichtenberg, disguised as a workers' social club. Gestapo intelligence estimated that between 50 and 70 resistance members used this location for meetings, document production, and coordination. The raid was scheduled for May 6th at 4 in the morning, and it would involve over 100 officers, including units from the SS and the regular police. This wasn't just an arrest operation. It was designed to decapitate the entire Berlin resistance in a single strike. If the raid succeeded, everything Wilhelm had worked for over the past year would be erased. Every life he had saved would ultimately mean nothing if the entire network collapsed. Wilhelm knew he had to warn them, but he also knew this was almost certainly his last act. The surveillance on him had become so intense that he could barely move without being watched. His apartment was likely bugged. His office phone was definitely monitored. Even his routine movements to and from headquarters were tracked by rotating surveillance teams. The counterintelligence division hadn't arrested him yet because they were still building their case, still trying to catch him in the act of passing information. They wanted absolute proof, an undeniable moment of treason that would justify not just his execution, but also serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider betrayal. Wilhelm understood this strategy because he had used it himself in investigations. The Gestapo didn't just want to stop the leak. They wanted to make an example, and Wilhelm was going to be that example. But not yet. Not before he delivered this one final warning. The meeting with Kerter was set for May 4th, just 2 days before the planned raid. Wilhelm and Kerter had developed the emergency protocol for situations exactly like this, a fallback location they would only use if standard contact methods were impossible. The location was the Tiergarten, Berlin's massive central park, specifically near the Soviet War Memorial that had been erected after the First World War. It was a public space, always crowded with people walking, children playing, couples sitting on benches. The theory was that surveillance teams would have difficulty maintaining visual contact in such an open, unpredictable environment. But Wilhelm knew that theory was optimistic at best. The counterintelligence division was too good, too experienced. They would flood the park with operatives if they suspected he was making contact. Wilhelm's only advantage was timing and misdirection. He had to make them believe he was doing something else entirely. On the morning of May 4th, Wilhelm went through his normal routine with mechanical precision. He arrived at headquarters at 7, reviewed case files, attended a briefing on an unrelated investigation. At lunch, instead of going to the park, he went to a restaurant he frequented, ate slowly, read a newspaper, and returned to the office. He stayed late, working until nearly 8 in the evening, long after most officers had gone home. The surveillance team watching him must have been bored to tears. Wilhelm was behaving like the most boring, predictable bureaucrat in Berlin, and that was exactly the point. He wanted them relaxed, convinced that he wasn't planning anything. Then, at 8:15, Wilhelm left headquarters and began walking home. His apartment was a 20-minute walk, a route he took almost every night, but 5 minutes into the walk, Wilhelm made his move. He turned suddenly into a crowded subway station, descended the stairs at a near run, and boarded a train just as the doors were closing. It was a classic evasion technique, and the surveillance team would have anticipated it. But Wilhelm wasn't trying to lose them permanently. He was trying to buy seconds, just enough time to create confusion and force them to scramble. Wilhelm rode the train for 3 stops, got off, sprinted up the stairs to street level and immediately hailed a taxi, something he almost never did. He told the driver to take him to the Tiergarten, and as the taxi pulled away from the curb, Wilhelm looked through the rear window and saw 2 men running toward the street, trying to flag down their own vehicle to follow. Wilhelm had maybe a 3-minute head start, possibly less. When the taxi reached the park entrance, Wilhelm threw money at the driver without waiting for change and ran into the darkness. The Tiergarten at night was a maze of paths, trees, and shadows. Wilhelm moved through it like a man possessed, his heart hammering, his breath coming in gasps. He reached the Soviet Memorial at 8:45, exactly on schedule. And there, sitting on a bench, pretending to read a book under a dim street lamp, was Käthe Niederkirchner. Wilhelm didn't slow down. He walked past her, dropped a folded piece of paper on the bench beside her, and kept moving without a word. The paper contained 3 pieces of information: the factory address, the raid date, and the words, "Total Liquidation Operation." Käthe picked up the paper, tucked it into her book, and stood up to leave. The entire exchange took less than 5 seconds, and then Wilhelm heard the voices behind him, men shouting orders, the sound of running footsteps. The surveillance team had caught up. The ghost had finally been seen. Wilhelm didn't run. Running would have been an admission of guilt, and even now, even with surveillance teams closing in, and his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst, Wilhelm understood that his only chance was to maintain the fiction. He was a Gestapo officer taking an evening walk through the park. Nothing more. He turned calmly as 3 men approached him from different directions, their faces shadowed, but their posture unmistakable. These were counterintelligence operatives, and they had just watched him make contact with someone. The lead officer, a man named Hauptsturmführer Klaus Becker, who Wilhelm knew from headquarters, walked up with his hand resting casually on the pistol at his belt. Becker didn't draw the weapon. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Becker asked Wilhelm what he was doing in the park at this hour. Wilhelm's response was almost boring in its mundanity. He said he had been working late, felt restless, and decided to take a walk to clear his head before going home. It was the truth, technically, just missing the critical detail about treason. Becker didn't believe him. That much was obvious from his expression. But belief wasn't the issue. Evidence was the issue. Becker asked who the woman on the bench was, the one Wilhelm had walked past. Wilhelm said he had no idea, that there were dozens of people in the park, that he hadn't been paying attention to anyone in particular. It was a weak answer, and everyone standing there knew it. But Becker couldn't prove contact had been made. He hadn't seen a physical exchange. Wilhelm had been careful enough, fast enough, that the actual moment of the drop might have been missed in the darkness. Becker made a decision. He told Wilhelm that he was going to escort him back to headquarters for a formal interview. Not an arrest, not yet, but a request that carried the weight of a command. Wilhelm agreed immediately, acting confused and cooperative, asking if there was a problem he should know about. Becker didn't answer. He simply gestured for Wilhelm to start walking. As they left the park, Wilhelm glanced back once and saw that the bench where Käthe had been sitting was empty. She had disappeared into the night with the warning. The mission was complete. Now came the price. The interview room at Gestapo headquarters was familiar territory for Wilhelm. He had conducted hundreds of interrogations in rooms exactly like this one. Bare walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and a light positioned to shine directly into the subject's eyes. But sitting on the other side of that table, waiting while Becker reviewed his notes and another officer stood silently by the door, Wilhelm experienced what his victims had experienced, the sick, twisting fear of knowing that your life was balanced on the edge of a knife. Becker started with simple questions. Where had Wilhelm been that evening? Who had he spoken to? Why had he gone to the Tiergarten specifically? Wilhelm answered each question with the same calm professionalism he had used in his previous interviews, never contradicting himself, never offering information that hadn't been asked for. He was good at this. He had been trained by the best, But he also knew that training only lasted so long under real pressure. Then Becker changed tactics. He asked Wilhelm if he had noticed anything unusual about raid operations over the past year. Wilhelm said no. Becker asked if Wilhelm had any theories about why so many operations were failing, why targets kept disappearing before arrests could be made. Wilhelm said it was probably a combination of unreliable informants and improved resistance counter-surveillance. It was a reasonable answer, the kind of analysis any competent investigator would provide. But Becker wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, and told Wilhelm that counterintelligence had been investigating a leak inside the Gestapo for months, that they had narrowed the suspects down to a very small group, that Wilhelm's name was on that list. And then Becker asked the question that Wilhelm had been dreading since the investigation began. "Are you the leak, Kraus?" The room went silent. The officer by the door shifted his weight slightly, his hand moving closer to his sidearm. Wilhelm looked directly at Becker and said no. The interrogation continued for 3 hours. Becker went over Wilhelm's access to classified information, his movements over the past months, his contacts outside the Gestapo. He asked about the library Wilhelm had been visiting during lunch breaks. He asked about the woman in the park. He asked about Wilhelm's political beliefs, his family, his fiancée. Every question was designed to create an opening, a contradiction, a moment of weakness that could be exploited. But Wilhelm held. He didn't break. He answered every question with the steady composure of a man who had nothing to hide, even though they both knew he was lying. Finally, at nearly midnight, Becker ended the interview. He told Wilhelm he was free to go home, but that the investigation was continuing and that Wilhelm should consider himself under active scrutiny. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't even a formal accusation, but it was a warning. The Gestapo knew Wilhelm was guilty. They just couldn't prove it yet. And Wilhelm understood as he walked out of headquarters into the cold Berlin night that he had maybe 48 hours before they came for him again. 48 hours before the evidence they needed materialized. 48 hours before the ghost was finally dragged into the light. But those 48 hours were enough. The warning had been delivered. The resistance would evacuate the factory. And Wilhelm Kraus had accomplished exactly what he had set out to do, even if it cost him everything. The resistance acted on Wilhelm's warning with the kind of speed that comes from desperation and experience. Käthe Niederkirchner spent the night of May 4th moving through Berlin's underground network, passing the information from cell to cell, using couriers and coded messages to reach every person connected to the Lichtenberg factory. By dawn on May 5th, less than 24 hours before the Gestapo raid was scheduled to begin, the factory basement had been completely evacuated. Documents were burned. Equipment was dismantled and moved to scattered locations across the city. The people who had been using that space as their coordination hub disappeared into safe houses, false identities, and the anonymous chaos of wartime Berlin. When the Gestapo arrived at 4 in the morning on May 6th, with over 100 officers ready to execute the largest resistance roundup in Berlin's history, they found an empty basement. No people, no evidence. No resistance network, just bare walls and the faint smell of burned paper. The operation was a complete failure, and that failure sealed Wilhelm Kraus's fate. The morning after the botched raid, Hauptsturmführer Becker walked into Gestapo headquarters with a file folder under his arm and murder in his eyes. The counterintelligence division had spent months building this operation. They had invested surveillance resources, manpower and political capital into what was supposed to be a devastating blow against the Berlin underground. Instead, they had been humiliated. Someone had warned the resistance, and that someone had to be inside the Gestapo. The list of suspects who had access to the raid schedule was extremely short. Wilhelm Kraus was at the top of that list, but Becker still didn't have direct proof. He hadn't caught Wilhelm passing information. He hadn't intercepted a message. He hadn't found incriminating documents in Wilhelm's apartment or office. All he had was circumstantial evidence and a pattern that pointed in one direction. In any normal legal system, it wouldn't have been enough to convict, but the Gestapo didn't operate under normal legal rules. They operated under suspicion, and suspicion was all Becker needed. Wilhelm was arrested at his desk at 9:30 in the morning on May 7th. No warning, no formal charges read aloud, just two officers walking into his office, telling him to stand up and placing him in handcuffs. His colleagues watched in silence as he was led through the headquarters hallway, past the offices where he had worked for 5 years, down the stairs to the basement detention cells where he had once brought suspects himself. The cell they locked him in was 3 meters by 3 meters, a concrete box with a metal cot and a single light bulb that never turned off. Wilhelm sat on that cot and waited. He knew what was coming next. The Gestapo had a protocol for suspected internal traitors, and that protocol involved torture, not the kind of torture designed to extract information, because they already suspected Wilhelm didn't have any information left to give. This was punishment torture, designed to break a person completely before their execution. Wilhelm had roughly 24 hours before it began. But something unexpected happened during those 24 hours. Word of Wilhelm's arrest spread through the Gestapo headquarters faster than official reports could travel. Officers who had worked with Wilhelm, who had known him as a competent and reliable colleague, began asking questions. Some of those questions were skeptical. Was the evidence really solid? Could Wilhelm Kraus, of all people, really be a traitor? Others were more calculated. If Wilhelm was the leak and he had been operating for months, who else might be involved? The paranoia that the Gestapo used as a weapon against German society began turning inward with devastating efficiency. Counterintelligence started looking at everyone who had been close to Wilhelm. His superiors were questioned about why they hadn't noticed anything suspicious. His subordinates were investigated for possible complicity. The organization that prided itself on total control was eating itself from the inside. And in the middle of this chaos, someone made a decision that probably saved Wilhelm's life, at least temporarily. A senior officer in the Gestapo leadership decided that Wilhelm Kraus should be interrogated by the Reich Security Main Office in Berlin, not by the local Gestapo division. It was a bureaucratic decision driven by politics and jurisdiction, but it meant Wilhelm would be transferred to a different facility for questioning. The transfer happened on May 9th. Wilhelm was moved from the Gestapo detention cells to Prince Albrechtstrasse, the headquarters of the SS and the most feared address in Nazi Germany. If the Gestapo headquarters was terrifying, Prince Albrechtstrasse was hell itself. This was where the Reich's most dangerous enemies were interrogated, where torture was refined into a science, where prisoners disappeared into basements and were never seen again. Wilhelm was placed in an isolation cell and left there for 3 days with no contact, no interrogation, just silence and the distant sounds of screaming from other parts of the building. The psychological warfare was deliberate. The SS wanted Wilhelm broken before they even started asking questions. They wanted him so desperate for human contact, so terrified of what was coming, that he would confess to anything just to make it stop. And it almost worked. By the 3rd day, Wilhelm was hallucinating from sleep deprivation and stress, but even in that state, even when the interrogators finally came for him and began their work, Wilhelm Kraus did not confess. He did not give them names. He did not confirm their suspicions. He had accepted that he was going to die, and that acceptance gave him a strange kind of freedom. The ghost in the machine had been caught, but even in captivity, even under torture, he refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking completely. It was the last act of defiance available to him, and Wilhelm held on to it with everything he had left. The interrogation of Wilhelm Kraus lasted 2 weeks, and what happened in those sessions remains partially documented in SS records that survived the war. The reports are clinical, detached, describing the process with the same bureaucratic precision the Nazis applied to all their atrocities. They detail the methods used, enhanced interrogation techniques that included sleep deprivation, stress positions, beatings and psychological torture designed to destroy a person's sense of identity and will. But what the reports don't capture, what no document can truly convey, is the extraordinary fact that Wilhelm never gave them what they wanted. He never confessed to being the leak. He never provided names of resistance contacts. He never confirmed the connection to Käthe Niederkirchner or any other member of the underground. The interrogators broke his body, they shattered his health, but they could not break the fundamental core of who he had chosen to become. And this silence, this refusal to cooperate even under unbearable circumstances, created a bizarre legal problem for the SS. Without a confession, without concrete evidence, they couldn't formally charge Wilhelm with treason. They had suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and a failed raid, but nothing that would stand up even in the corrupted legal system of Nazi Germany. So the SS made a different decision. On May 23, 1943, Wilhelm Kraus was transferred from Prinz-Albrecht-Straße to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, located 30 kilometers north of Berlin. He wasn't charged with a crime. He wasn't given a trial. He was simply disappeared into the camp system under a process called Schutzhaft, protective custody, a legal fiction the Nazis used to imprison anyone they considered dangerous without bothering with formal legal proceedings. Wilhelm was assigned prisoner number 78432 and sent to the political prisoners section of the camp, a designation reserved for communists, resistance members, and others deemed enemies of the state. The irony was almost poetic. Wilhelm had spent 5 years hunting people exactly like the ones he was now imprisoned with, and now he was one of them, wearing the same striped uniform, subjected to the same dehumanizing routine, living in the same brutal conditions. The camp guards who processed him had no idea who he was or what he had done. To them, he was just another political prisoner, another number to be worked to death in the quarry or the factories that surrounded the camp. But word of who Wilhelm was spread quickly among the other prisoners. In the close, desperate world of Sachsenhausen, information was currency, and the story of a Gestapo officer imprisoned for helping the resistance was too extraordinary to stay secret. Some prisoners didn't believe it. They assumed Wilhelm was a plant, an informant sent in by the SS to identify resistance members who had been captured. Others were simply too broken, too focused on their own survival to care about Wilhelm's story one way or another. But a small group, mostly political prisoners with connections to the Berlin underground, approached Wilhelm carefully and asked him directly, was it true? Had he really been the source of the warnings that saved so many lives? Wilhelm confirmed it, and in that confirmation something remarkable happened. The political prisoners, men and women who had every reason to hate anyone associated with the Gestapo, began to protect him. They shared their meager food rations with him. They warned him about dangerous guards. They taught him how to survive in the camp, which rules could be bent, and which ones would get you killed. They did this not out of forgiveness, because what Wilhelm had done as a Gestapo officer before his awakening was unforgivable, but out of recognition. Wilhelm had made a choice that few people in his position ever made, and he was paying the price for that choice. In the moral landscape of Sachsenhausen, that counted for something. Wilhelm survived in Sachsenhausen for 4 months. His health, already destroyed by the interrogations at Prinz-Albrecht-Straße, deteriorated rapidly under the camp conditions. He developed dysentery, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and suffered from infections that the camp's non-existent medical care couldn't treat. By September of 1943, Wilhelm was dying, and everyone in his barracks knew it. The political prisoners who had befriended him did what they could to make his final weeks bearable, but there was only so much anyone could do in a place designed to kill people slowly. On September 28, 1943, Wilhelm Kraus died in his bunk at Sachsenhausen. The official camp records list the cause of death as typhus, though that diagnosis was almost certainly invented to explain away a death from starvation, disease, and the accumulated trauma of torture. He was 32 years old. His body was cremated in the camp's ovens, and his ashes were dumped in a mass grave with hundreds of other prisoners who died that month. There was no funeral, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of his existence beyond a number in a ledger. Wilhelm Kraus, the Gestapo officer who betrayed everything he was supposed to represent to save people he would never meet, died alone and anonymous in a concentration camp run by the same system he had once served. But his story didn't end there. Before Wilhelm died, he had one final conversation with a fellow prisoner, a man named Otto Fischer, who was a member of the Red Orchestra Resistance Network. Wilhelm knew he was dying, and he wanted to make sure that someone survived who could tell the story of what he had done. He gave Otto specific details, names, dates, and the methods he had used to pass warnings to the resistance. Otto memorized everything, knowing that if he survived the camp, he would have a responsibility to share this information with the world. Otto Fischer did survive. He was liberated when Soviet forces reached Sachsenhausen in April of 1945. And in the chaotic years after the war, as Germany tried to reckon with its past, Otto began telling people about Wilhelm Kraus. He told resistance survivors, he told historians, he told anyone who would listen about the Gestapo officer who had saved hundreds of lives and died in a concentration camp for his choice. Some believed him. Others were skeptical, unable to reconcile the image of a helpful Gestapo officer with everything they knew about that organization. But Otto persisted, and slowly, documentation began to emerge that confirmed Wilhelm's story. After the war, investigators found fragments of Gestapo records that had survived the bombing and the Nazi attempts to destroy evidence. They found the internal investigation reports that had focused on Wilhelm. They found interrogation transcripts from Prinz Albrechtstrasse. They found the Sachsenhausen camp records with Wilhelm's prisoner number and death date. And most importantly, they found resistance survivors who remembered the warnings, the coded messages, the chalk marks on door frames, and the mysterious source inside the Gestapo who had kept them one step ahead of death. These survivors, when interviewed decades later, confirmed that someone had been helping them, and the timeline of those warnings matched exactly with Wilhelm Kraus's period of activity. The evidence was fragmentary, incomplete, and scattered across destroyed archives and fading memories, but it was enough. Enough to confirm that Wilhelm Kraus had existed, that he had done what Otto Fischer claimed, and that his actions had saved lives during one of the darkest periods in human history. But even with this confirmation, Wilhelm's story remained largely unknown outside of small circles of historians and resistance researchers. He was never formally recognized by the German government. No street was named after him. No memorial was erected. The ghost in the machine had saved hundreds of lives and died for his choice, but history had largely forgotten him. So why don't we know Wilhelm Kraus's name? Why isn't his story taught in schools, commemorated in museums, or celebrated as one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in World War II? The answer is uncomfortable and reveals something troubling about how we remember history. Wilhelm Kraus was a perpetrator before he became a rescuer. For 5 years he worked for the Gestapo, an organization responsible for unspeakable atrocities. Before he started sending warnings, he participated in the machinery of oppression. He signed arrest orders. He interrogated suspects. He was complicit in the Nazi system, even if he later rejected it. And post-war Germany, both East and West, struggled with how to categorize people like Wilhelm. He didn't fit the clean narrative of heroes and villains that societies need to process trauma. He was morally complicated, a man who had done terrible things before doing extraordinary things. And so history took the easier path. It simply forgot him. His story was too messy, too challenging, too difficult to reduce to a simple moral lesson. It was easier to focus on resistance fighters who had opposed the Nazis from the beginning, rather than wrestling with the troubling redemption of someone who had once served the regime. But Wilhelm's story matters precisely because it's complicated. It matters because it demonstrates that people can change, even in the most extreme circumstances, even when that change comes at unbearable cost. Wilhelm wasn't a saint. He was a man who made catastrophic moral choices, who participated in evil, and who then, confronted with the human consequences of that evil, chose a different path. That choice didn't erase what he had done before. It didn't grant him moral absolution, but it did save hundreds of lives, and it cost him everything. In an era when we're constantly debating questions of complicity, accountability, and the possibility of redemption, Wilhelm Kraus's story offers no easy answers. It just offers a truth, that even inside the darkest systems, individual choices still matter. That even when you've been part of something monstrous, you can still choose to become something else. And that the price of that choice might be your life, but it's still a choice worth making. The resistance members who survived because of Wilhelm's warnings lived full lives after the war. Some became teachers, activists, politicians. Some had children and grandchildren who exist today. Because Wilhelm Kraus decided that 73 Jewish children in a church basement mattered more than his career and his safety. When historians estimate that Wilhelm's actions saved between 200 and 300 lives, they're not just counting the people who escaped arrest, they're counting all the descendants, all the future generations that exist because those people survived. The ripples of Wilhelm's choice extend forward through time in ways that can never be fully calculated, and yet his name remains unknown. There's no Wilhelm Kraus memorial, no foundation bearing his name, no annual ceremony remembering his sacrifice. He exists only in fragmentary archives, in the memories of researchers who stumble across his story, and in the testimony of Otto Fischer, who kept his promise to tell the world what Wilhelm had done. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. Wilhelm didn't save people for recognition or glory. He saved them because, in a moment of moral clarity in a church basement, he saw what his society had become and couldn't continue being part of it. The ghost in the machine stayed a ghost even after death, a shadow in history that most people will never know existed. But the lives he saved were real. The children who grew up because of his warnings were real. The resistance networks that continued fighting because they had advance warning of Gestapo operations were real. Wilhelm Kraus might be forgotten, but his impact on history is undeniable. Every person who survived because of his warnings changed the world in small ways, had conversations that wouldn't have happened, made decisions that altered other lives, contributed to the reconstruction of Germany and Europe after the war. The ghost's legacy isn't in monuments or recognition. It's in the continued existence of people who should have died but didn't. This is the story that history forgot. The story of a Gestapo officer who betrayed everything he was supposed to represent and saved hundreds of lives in the process. The story of a man who paid for his moral awakening with torture, imprisonment, and death in a concentration camp. The story of the ghost in the machine who warned the resistance 32 times before the machine finally caught him. Wilhelm Kraus existed. He made a choice that most of us will never have to face, and he died alone and anonymous, knowing that the people he saved would probably never know his name. But now you know. Now you know that inside one of history's most evil organizations, there was a man who chose differently, who saw the horror clearly and decided that stopping it, even in small ways, even at the cost of his own life, was worth it. That's not a story about redemption. It's not a story about forgiveness. It's a story about choice. And in the end, that might be the most important kind of story there is. Because if Wilhelm Kraus could make that choice, in that time, in that place, inside the Gestapo itself, then the rest of us have no excuse for claiming that circumstances make moral action impossible. We always have a choice. The only question is whether we're willing to pay the price for making the right one.